Hello and welcome to this talk at Social Ontology 2020, Finding Fault Where Fault is to be Found, Jointability and the Problem of Collective Harm. What is this talk about? The goal is to show how the notion of jointability plays a crucial and hitherto ignored role in understanding the problem of collective harm. The talk is structured as follows. I explain the problem of collective harm, then I sketch the search for solutions so far, and then I show an extra tricky kind of collective harm case, which shows a need to consider jointability. What is the problem of collective harm? Consider a few examples. Climate change. All of us together cause CO2 emissions, which in turn cause climate change and its adverse effects. Yet, none of us individually contributes enough to make a difference to these harms. Second case, consumer choice. Many people buy cheap products that are produced under harmful working conditions. Yet, no single consumer's choice makes a difference to how many people are employed under such conditions. Third case, political protest. A government implements some policy that is harmful to a minority group or to non-citizens. If enough citizens were to protest against the policy, then it would be revoked. Yet, no individual's act of protesting or staying at home makes a difference to whether the policy is revoked. Fourth example, ignored Mayday. A sailing crew encounters another boat in distress. But the sailors on the boat deem it too much hassle to help, and as a consequence, someone on the other boat dies. Yet each individual sailor excuses themselves, saying they could not have prevented the tragedy on their own. What do all these cases have in common, and how do they generate a philosophical problem? What the cases all have in common is that a group or a collection of agents either brings about or fails to prevent some harm. Call that collective harm. Yet it seems that no individual member of the group could have made a difference to the harm. No difference. Call that the claim no difference. Third, it is hence difficult to see what reasons individuals could have for acting differently. Call that no difference, no reasons. Yet it seems that something is going morally wrong. Call that claim on the hook. If a collection of agents brings about or fails to prevent some harm, then some agent must be morally at fault for this outcome. And here we kind of have an implicit other things equal kind of provision, right? So say it's not that they have something more important to do on the sailing boat than to save the victims on the other boat, say, right? So then something is wrong and we need to find some sort of fault. So what is the challenge then? Well, the challenge is to accommodate this intuition on the hook. So to identify what exactly is going wrong, to identify some moral fault and or some reasons to act differently. Right? And the challenge is there because the agents don't make a difference, and it seems difficult then to see what reasons they might have for acting differently. Conversely, as opposed to the challenge to find some kind of account, you could use the problem of collective harm or given collective harm case as a counterexample to a moral theory by saying, well, here's a given theory which you advocate about what our reasons for action are, what our moral duties are. But in a given case, this theory cannot account for the intuition that there's something morally wrong. So that is the challenge of collective harms. Now we look for a solution for this problem, and there's a long-standing literature on this. I'm not going to go into much detail, but I'm going to explain the dialectic of the search, and then in order to show how the kind of particularly tricky example that I want to discuss in more detail fits in. So the dialectic is typically this. You start with a problem case, for example, the climate change case. Then someone presents a solution, And mostly the solution comes in the form of some way of finding fault, even though no individual could have made a difference. Then someone presents a new problem case in which this solution does not find fault. And then you start over again at step 1. Right? You have a new problem case, you need a new solution. Let's look at some examples. One possibility to solve the problem of collective harm are collective approaches. The most radical would be to say, well, look, it's the group is able to make a difference, right? As a group as a whole. So why not attribute fault to the group? The individuals, they all act rightly, say, by keeping on sailing past the boat in distress, but the group of them together, they act wrongly. Now, a problem here is that this does not work for harms caused by loose collections of agents. Loose collections which do not form a collective agent in their own right. So the group of all consumers together is not quite the same thing as a sailing crew. Take another example of how to solve the problem in cases where there might not be a collective agent to find fault with. Here the solution would be to deny the principle no difference, no reason. I have to say it's not just that the fact that you can make an actual difference that gives you reasons, but also making an expected difference gives you reasons. So how does this work? Consider consumer choice again. So individuals, they may not in fact not make a difference, right? By buying a sweatshop produced t-shirt, you may not make a difference to how to the working conditions of people making t-shirts. But you don't know that. Right? So there's a tiny probability that you cause a big harm, that your purchase actually does register in some corporate decision-making process, and that it does have an influence on how a company is producing its products. So then you multiply the small probability with a big harm, and you end up with expected harm or expected negative expected outcomes. And these expected outcomes determine individuals' obligations, so the claim would go. And that would be a way of finding fault with individuals, even though they don't make a difference, because they might make a difference. Now, the problem with this approach, just talking through a bit more of the dialectic to work up to our new example, is that it doesn't apply to cases where agents know that they cannot make a difference, right? So the expected differences account trades on the impossibility of knowing whether you make a difference or not. Consider a different case, call it water pollution. Many people dump waste into a lake to the point of total ecological collapse. So the lake is just dead, and if you dump more waste into it, it doesn't make it any worse because it can't get any worse. Now suppose that everyone knows that the others will just keep dumping their waste, no matter what one does, right? No matter what I do, the others will just keep dumping their waste. Now, if that holds for all agents that they have this knowledge, then the expected difference made by using the resource of being able to dump the waste, is 0, right? So it doesn't make a difference whether or not I dump the waste, and also the expected difference is 0. So that account won't be able to find fault with anyone. How might you deal with that? Well, it's a strategy that I advocated in a paper a couple of years back, is to say, well, the moral fault does not attach to the individual's actions, but there's something else wrong about the agents. That is trading on ideas, in particular of Donald Reagan and Michael Zimmerman. So what might it be that might be wrong? And my proposal was that it's counterfactual. So the fact that you would not act differently, even if others stop polluting, there is something problematic about this. Why is it problematic? Well, I contend that you ought to be such, not just that you bring about the best outcomes you can bring about, that you prevent harms if you can prevent them, etc., but also that you ought to be such that the following counterfactual holds of you. If others acted differently, then you would adjust your actions so as to bring about a better outcome in that new situation. And the case of polluting the water, right, is a case where the reason why individuals cannot make a difference is precisely because they don't satisfy this counterfactual. It's precisely because they will just keep polluting no matter what others do. That makes it the case that they don't make a difference, so we can't find fault with them for making a negative difference. But if we can find fault with them not satisfying this counterfactual, not counterfactually making the world better, so to say, then we're still able to accommodate on the hook. Now, there are two challenges that arise from this dialectic of the problem of collective harm, and there are different ways of telling the story. It's just because I'm speaking, and it comes from my thinking that the story ends with my proposal, but the overall dialectic really is that there are different proposals in different kinds of cases. So there are two challenges which I see for solving the problem for good, so to say, if you want to have a comprehensive solution. First is a challenge of combination. So how do the different solutions relate to each other? Can they be combined to cover a broader range of cases without being kind of an ad hoc kind of collection of approaches? Do maybe some approaches subsume others under themselves? I'm going to sidestep this challenge here. The second challenge that I am focusing on today is the challenge of comprehensiveness. Does the best solution or the best combination of solutions really cover all cases? Or is it just another step on the next kind of move in the dialectic, that someone comes up with a better case or more tricky case, which our preferred solution or combination of solutions cannot cover, and we're back to square one, so to say. Now, the problem I see and that I want to point out here for achieving comprehensiveness is that the task of solving the problem itself has not been precisely specified. Or there's a mistake, or put differently, there's a mistake in the way the task has been specified, which might make it impossible to satisfy comprehensiveness until that problem is rectified. And now, so that's what I call an extra tricky class of collective harm cases. Let's call this case failed rescue. Imagine a sail training yacht, maybe some 10 people on it, 1 instructor and 9 students. They sail in unexpectedly heavy weather. The forecast was fine and it just turned really nasty. That can happen. They encounter a capsized boat and they see people, the crew from that boat, swimming around the boat, trying to hold on, and just minutes from drowning. Now, if they performed the right kinds of actions on the training yacht, then the sailors together could stop the yacht and retrieve the victims, right? There are certain things you need to do to stop a boat which is racing through the storm, and to stop it at the right place, to stop it safely, and to get people out of the water. However, the training yacht fails to stop on time and the victims drown. The sailors, so that looks like a collective harm case, right? So they could have prevented the harm, it seems, yet they haven't. Now let's assume further it being a sail training yacht and it being fine weather when they set out and in the forecast, they have not yet practiced the required expert maneuvers, right? They're there to train them after all. And further, due to the heavy weather, they are not able to really communicate in any detail with each other or to react to each other's actions. It's very hard to see what others are up to if you haven't trained kind of maneuvers. You don't quite know what it means that someone now goes to the wheel or that someone now does something with a given rope on the boat, say. Now, it seems under those conditions, no individual sailor could have made a difference by acting differently, right? You could have done whatever, you could have shouted, no one would have heard what you shouted. You could have started what you think is the right maneuver, but others wouldn't know how to chip in. There's just nothing any individual, including the instructor, say, could have done to make a difference in the situation and to stop the yacht on time, right? You just would have to have practiced before. Now, in the case of failed rescue, the approach I presented earlier about counterfactuals doesn't work, right? So it's implausible to hold that the sailors ought to be such that they would act differently, namely play their part in the correct rescue maneuver if others did their part, because you can't react to each other and you don't know what your part is. So the counterfactual requirement to not require the impossible needs to be weakened. If such sensitivity to others' actions is possible, then you ought to be such that if others acted differently, you would adjust your actions to bring about a better outcome. But once you weaken the requirement in that way, you don't find fault and failed rescue because the antecedent isn't satisfied, right? It is not the case that you ought to be such that if others had acted differently, etc., etc. So we can't find fault on the counterfactual level, and we can't find fault with the individual actions, say, of just holding on for dear life and not playing your part in a rescue maneuver. So where does it leave us? This seems to be at first sight a tricky case which stops this counterfactual wrongness approach from working. However, I think that's not the case, and that's where we get to specifying the problem of collective harm. I think it's actually inappropriate to try to find fault with any of the sailors in the first place. We can reject this intuition or this demand that somehow someone must be at fault because a harm hasn't been prevented. But then it follows that it's not always the case that if collective harm holds, so if collective harm has been produced or has collectively not been prevented, we need to find fault. We can still say the situation is bad, but it does not reflect negatively on any agent. Then we need to re-specify on the hook, called on the hook star. If a collection of agents brings about or fails to prevent some harm and is jointly able to avoid doing so, then some agent must be morally at fault for this outcome. So there's an additional condition for the demand to find fault. What is this thing, jointability? What we need here to understand how it also could have slipped the attention in the discussion so far is a contrast between possibility and ability. It is perfectly possible that all the trainees perform the right actions at the right time. Right? They can move still even in the heavy weather, and it's possible that they all do the right things and the boat stops and the victims get rescued. But without prior training to coordinate that quickly, it is not something that the group is able to do. You can compare this with, like, say, if you know a poem by heart, you're able to recite it. If you don't know it by heart, it's possible that you happen to utter the right words in sequence, but you do not know, you're not able to do so, right? You're not able to recite the poem. Now, when does joint ability obtain? I can't go into detail about necessary and sufficient conditions here, but I try to propose a hopefully uncontentious test of ability, and I'm curious to hear how uncontentious it really is. Ability, I think, links actions and intention. So if you're able to fly, if and only if you're able to fly, then it holds. If you intend to do it, you will normally do it. So if you don't know the poem, your intention to recite the poem does not translate into you reciting it. If you do know it, if you intend to recite it, and you don't get prevented from doing so, etc., then you will recite it. You're able to do it. How does that apply to joint ability? The claim is that if and only if a collective is jointly able to do something, then if all the agents or the members of the collective intend to do their part to make the collective do the thing, then the collective will do it. So how does it apply to failed rescue? Suppose that all the people on the training vessel really intend that the rescue maneuver be executed quickly, or if you don't want intentions, that they each intend to do their part so that the rescue maneuver gets executed quickly. That does not make them execute the maneuver, right? Because they cannot coordinate. So these intentions do not translate into the quick rescue maneuver. So they're not jointly able to do it. Why does that matter to the problem of collective harm? Well, pointing out joint ability and contrasting it from mere possibility, which sometimes gets hidden in this notion of avoidable harm, right? Avoidable is too vague. We have to really say a harm that you're jointly able to avoid. Pointing that out allows us to reject cases like failed rescue, which would be overly hard, right? It's too demanding, and a comprehensive solution to the collective harm problem does not have to cover these cases. Interestingly, it also allows us to detect theories that overgenerate, that falsely find fault in such cases. For example, a collective obligation approach might falsely hold that the crew together is at fault, or a consequentialist style approach might falsely hold that each crew member is required to do their bit. And then find fault with either the group or the individuals, even though no fault needs to be found. In conclusion, jointability and collective harm. I conclude that we must distinguish those cases of collective harm where a collection of agents is jointly able to avoid the harm, and those where it is unable to do so. And it is only in cases with joint ability that we need to find fault. In cases where the joint ability does not obtain, any position or any ethical position which nonetheless ascribes fault to the group or to the agents individually is mistaken. So the problem of collective harm is thus the problem of finding fault where and only where fault needs to be found for collective harm. And that where and only where is exactly the place of where joint ability to avoid the harm obtains, as opposed to where joint ability does not obtain. Thank you very much.